Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Superman for All Seasons. Now, Superman for All Seasons is a Superman graphic novel written by Jeph Loeb and illustrated by Tim Sale, and of course published by DC Comics. Now, this was first published in 1998 as a 4-part comic book series, but later on those 4 parts were put together as one graphic novel, or trade paperback, whichever you want to call it. I mean, comic book fans argue till they're red in the face what actually constitutes as a graphic novel. For me personally, since the story is relatively self-contained, I'm comfortable calling this a graphic novel, but once again, I mean, everybody, I think, has their own definition of what a graphic novel actually is. For me, a graphic novel is something where, even if it was originally published as a limited series, as long as that limited series is telling an open and shut story, I can count that as a graphic novel. Now, Jeph Loeb is also the writer of the Batman graphic novel The Long Halloween and its sequel, Dark Victory, and he's also written several other Batman stories. He's also written stuff for Marvel as well, and he's actually a producer on several of the Marvel Netflix series like Jessica Jones and Daredevil, and I think Luke Cage as well. I actually think he produced all of the Netflix Marvel series. And Tim Sale has also illustrated several of Jeph Loeb's comics before this. Now, I'm doing this review as part of a series of Superman reviews that I'm now planning on doing every January. Starting in 2013, I decided that every January I was going to do different Batman reviews, but starting last year I decided to also do some Superman reviews as well, because Superman and Batman are like so close to each other, so I decided starting last year to do Superman reviews, so this is sort of a continuation of the Superman reviews that I did last January. And of course, once I'm done with these Superman reviews, I will be doing some Batman reviews as well. Now, even though this story is relatively self-contained, it is apparently supposed to take place, like, parallel to the events of the 1986 John Byrne Superman comic, The Man of Steel. Now, Superman for All Seasons is set over the course of the 4 seasons, spring, summer, fall, and winter, and essentially it sort of chronicles Clark Kent's first year as Superman, and each chapter is narrated by a different person whose life has been affected by Clark Kent and or Superman in either a positive or a negative way. Now, the first chapter, Spring, is narrated by Jonathan Kent, Kal-El's adopted father, and this first chapter is really about Jonathan Kent worrying what will become of his son, knowing that his son is not a normal human being, and knowing that his son has all these powers. Like, he's worried about what will become of his son as he gets older. And it's also about the young Clark Kent trying to find his place in the world and figure out what exactly he should be doing with these powers. And in this section of the story, a tornado hits Smallville, and after saving the life of a man, he decides to use his powers for good, and basically this chapter ends with him becoming Superman. The second chapter, Summer, is narrated by Lois Lane, and it's really about how the city of Metropolis and the world in general is reacting to a being like Superman revealing himself to the world. And this chapter is also about how Lois Lane's view of the world is completely altered by the appearance of a being like Superman. The third chapter, Fall, is narrated by Lex Luthor, and it's really about Lex Luthor trying to get his revenge on Superman for something that you find out that Superman did to him between the events of the second and third chapter. And the way that Lex Luthor tries to get revenge on Superman is he really tries to break his spirit spirit, and I don't want to give away what Lex Luthor does in this chapter, but what he does is really kind of fucked up. The fourth chapter, Winter, is narrated by Lana Lang, Clark Kent's childhood friend, and it's really about how her life was affected by Clark Kent, and also how her life changed after Clark Kent revealed his secret to her. And this chapter is really about Clark Kent returning to Smallville after what happened in Chapter 3, and it's really about him questioning whether or not he's doing the right thing being Superman. And even though each chapter is narrated by a different person, ultimately the entire book is really about Clark Kent, and it's about him trying to find his place in the world. But I thought Superman for All Seasons was an excellent comic, and one of the things I really liked about this was it was, in essence, a coming-of-age story, and I'm kind of a sucker for coming-of-age stories, so that's one of the things that really appealed to me about this. And I also loved how this book really delved into the psyches of several of the characters from the Superman mythos, and I actually thought the first chapter, where it's all narrated by Jonathan Kent, I found that chapter to be genuinely emotionally moving. Like, I honestly want to say the first chapter, Spring, is probably my favorite of the 4 chapters, because I really found it to be really kind of touching. I also really liked the third chapter where it delved into the psyche of Lex Luthor, who many would argue is Superman's greatest adversary. And I liked how it showed that even though Lex Luthor is a scumbag, you could tell in his own fucked up way, he thinks he's doing the right thing, and he thinks he's genuinely protecting Metropolis from Superman. And you also find out that Lex Luthor was the victim of child abuse, which definitely makes you feel some sympathy for him. It doesn't excuse his actions, but it definitely makes you sympathize with him to a certain extent. Now, I'll admit I'm somewhat of a novice when it comes to the Superman comics, so I'm not sure if that aspect of Lex Luthor was explored in any Superman comics prior to this, but even if it was, I do think it was really well done here. And there are also some definite religious undertones in this book, like, there's certain points in the story where Clark Kent goes to his town's priest for advice, so you could tell he's definitely seeking a lot of comfort in religion, but also there's a scene in this book where Clark and Lana Lang are making snow angels, and the snow angel that Clark ends up making looks a lot like the image of Jesus Christ. I also really liked Tim Sale's artwork in this book. I'll admit that this kind of artwork is not usually my cup of tea. I kind of prefer comic book artwork that's a little more realistic looking, but for some reason I thought it really worked for this story. And honestly, I think I actually liked Tim Sale's artwork in this book better than some of the artwork he's done for the Batman comics that he's illustrated. But yeah, if you haven't read Superman for All Seasons, I highly recommend this. Now, this book was one of the primary inspirations behind the TV series Smallville. I also wouldn't be surprised if David Goyer and Zack Snyder might have taken some inspiration from this comic for Man of Steel. But yeah, that was my review on Superman for All Seasons by Jeph Loeb, and bye.